All right, everyone, let's talk about some mistakes that you are definitely going to want to avoid when gearing up in Raid Shadow Legends. Now, a lot of these are coming from my experience, and I can personally say that if I avoided these mistakes, I would have saved many, many millions of silver and a lot of headaches. So with that being said, let's just jump right into tip number one, and that is going to be make sure that you guys plan your gear out at least a little bit before you equip it. And there are several reasons why you are going to want to do this. Now, the obvious one is, I'm sure you guys already know that there is a penalty for unequipping gear in Raid Shadow Legends. You either have to pay silver, and that silver is going to correspond to the amount of stars that that piece of gear has, not the rarity. It's going to be the number of stars that it has. Or you have to actually flat out destroy the equipment itself. So if you don't plan out your gear and you kind of just experiment with equipping gear just kind of however you want to, not really thinking about it, obviously you're either going to have to destroy the gear if you change your mind, or you're going to have to pay silver, and that silver is just a wasted resource that you could spend upgrading that gear instead. So why spend silver removing gear, which doesn't really do anything, rather than when you could just spend it upgrading it and actually gaining power for your champions instead. So definitely plan it out, and this is especially important for set bonuses too. You know, it's really easy to just equip gear, not really thinking about it, but then you realize that you don't have the right pieces of gear for set bonuses. You might not necessarily have a good gloves for lifesteal, but you have really good weapons and helmets for it. Something that I realized is it's a lot easier to find really good pieces of gear for your weapons, your helmets, and your shield, because they don't have those different main stats. They're always going to have the same one. So you really want to plan this out. It can be very easy to make this mistake, and it's something that I did a whole lot of playing in Raid Shadow Legends, especially earlier on. Many, many millions of silver could have been saved if I just planned my gear out a little bit and I wrote it down, maybe kept track of it a little bit, or just kind of had an idea in mind before I actually officially ended up equipping it. Now, I can say this was a huge mistake. I spent way too much silver gearing out my Cold Heart. Again, with the lifesteal, same thing. I had really good pieces of lifesteal. These gloves, I was like, man, I definitely want to be using these 6-star crit damage gloves because crit damage is so unbelievably good for Cold Heart. And I ended up doing some experimentation. I didn't really plan it out, and I equipped a whole bunch of pieces of lifesteal gear, and then I realized that I had really good crit damage gear that I wanted to use because, again, crit damage is so good for Cold Heart. So what I ended up doing is I had to unequip a bunch of really expensive pieces of lifesteal. As you can see, very expensive when you get to unequipping 5- and 6-star gear, and it was just a massive headache, and I spent way too much silver doing it. I could have easily avoided this if I just planned it out and maybe wrote down my steps before I actually did it. So that's going to be a huge one. All right, tip number 2. This is another massive one, especially with the release of Faction Wars. And if you guys work on multiple champions, if you guys keep champions in your champion vault, you absolutely want to keep track of your equipped gear, especially on champions that you do not use that much. Now, I'll show you guys my champions in my champion vault as an example. You guys can see that there are plenty of champions that I have in my champion vault that have a ton of gear, and a lot of it is actually really useful bonuses like Immortal. We have Cruel bonuses, crit damage, crit chance, just lots of really good bonuses and lots of really good potentially gear that I might end up wanting to transfer from a champion that I don't really use that much one day to maybe a champion that's level 60 that I plan on using a lot. And if you don't end up keeping track of this, it can be really easy to lose track of all the gear that you have. Now, unfortunately, Raid Shadow Legends doesn't have the quality of life to make this easy, so you do have to kind of take your own measures. I just keep a Word document, notepad. You can use your phones, notepad software, however you want to do it. Just keep track of the gear on champions that you have that you don't use as much, and it will save you a lot of resources and a lot of headache later on when you're planning to upgrade champions that you do plan to use more. This is also really useful because of the limited artifact storage, and this is another reason why I have so many champions that are equipped in my champion vault, is because we're really limited on artifact storage. As you can see, I'm at 489 out of 500. So what I'm doing is I'm going through my champion vault and I'm actually equipping a lot of my champions in my champion vault, not only for Faction Wars, but also in order to free up some artifact storage. So really important to keep track of this stuff, so if I do decide to use it later, I know that that gear is there. It's not gone, and if you don't keep track of it, it could be really easy to lose track of some really good gear that you might have that is just lying around on a champion that you don't use that much. So that is another really big one for tip number 2. Definitely make sure that you avoid that mistake. Now let's move on to number 3. Now this is a huge one, and I want to talk about my Seeker as an example for this one, and you guys will see why this is super huge when it comes to a mistake that you want to avoid when gearing up, something I definitely made several times, especially on my Seeker, and that is you want to build around your best gear sets or your most difficult to acquire gear or gear sets. It doesn't actually even have to be a set, and you guys will see what I mean in a second. But you want to build around those ones first rather than working around your easier to acquire gear first. You want to work on that second. Now let's go to my Seeker so I can show you guys as an example here, and you'll see Seeker is, you're really going to want speed because of one of his skills. It's his Tailwind skill. Turn meter fill for your entire team, attack buff, short cooldown, absolutely fantastic champion, especially for the arena, and speed really is king for Seeker. So as you can see, I have pretty much all speed gear on my Seeker, but I actually have a couple pieces of divine speed gear as well. Now this is a mistake that I made, is I didn't really realize how good some of my divine speed gear was. And the problem with divine speed gear is it doesn't mix with speed gear. So you can't have one piece of divine speed and one piece of speed and still get a bonus. You have to only have 2 pieces of divine speed gear or only 2 pieces of speed gear. They are not going to mix. Now the problem is divine speed gear is very difficult to acquire. I've been playing the game since April, and this is pretty much the only somewhat decent divine speed gear that I have gotten since I started playing in April. I don't buy the gear packs either. I wouldn't recommend that unless you guys have way too much money. But quite a bit of a difference from speed. Now speed is a much easier gear set to acquire. You can get it in dungeons, you can even get it in the campaign. It's much more farmable, and as you can see, I have a lot more of it. So if I have really good pieces of divine speed gear, I probably want to build around that first because it's going to be a lot more difficult in order to replace. So I want to kind of equip that first because I am not really going to be able to make as many changes when it comes to it due to its much more limited availability. Now, if I wanted to end up changing some speed gear around, make some corrections, it's going to be a lot easier to do so because I have a lot more speed gear and it's just overall available a lot more. So you really want to do that. It'll save you a lot of headache, it'll save you a lot of silver from swapping gear, and it'll overall just make the gearing process a lot easier for you. Now this doesn't just apply to gear sets. I just used my Seeker, divine speed, and regular speed as an example, but another thing is if you just get a really good piece of gear overall, you know, sometimes you're going to get really insanely good legendaries that just roll really well. This is just an example. I'm sure I have even better gear than this, but I recently got this and it rolled double crit damage already. It's only +8, and I'm like, wow, that is a really good shield so far. It's got defense, it's got HP, it's got crit rate, it's got crit damage. Yes, it doesn't have speed, but still, that is a pretty fantastic 5-star legendary lifesteal shield. Depending on what it rolls for +12 and +16, you know, if it rolls double crit damage again, or sorry, double crit rate again, and it's got almost 30% crit rate, or it's got some other insanely good stats, it's going to be very difficult in order to get pieces of gear that are just one of a kind like that. So very similar to the divine speed, but now it's the stats that you're really focused on. If you get gear that's just so good that you really want to build around it, then work around that first because you're not really going to be switching it out later on. Work on that first, then as you move into the gearing process and you're working on gear later, the other pieces of gear, because they're not as good and they're a lot easier to switch out, it's going to give you a lot less of a headache in order to do so. Same thing with like the crit damage lifesteal gloves on my Cold Heart. These ones aren't really super amazing. They're still good, obviously, for 6-star lifesteal gloves, but I know I wanted these on my Cold Heart because Cold Heart benefits from crit damage so much from her Heartseeker skill. So I knew I wanted to do that. This was one of the very first pieces of gear that I equipped because I kind of built everything else around that instead. So definitely make sure that you guys end up doing that. All right, tip number 4. This is another really big one, and I want to show you guys an example where this cost me way too much of a headache, way too many millions of silver, and that is don't replace gear on champions until you have a plan and or you have figured out the stat differences with your replacement gear. Now let me explain this with a champion that is very important to make sure that you have the right gear on, and that is going to be Vrask. Where is he? I think he's actually in my inventory right here. Here he is. So Vrask is a very unique champion because not only is a certain stat going to be really important, which that stat is going to be crit rate, but he actually has a major skill, pretty much the biggest reason why you're going to be using Vrask. This skill right here, Cannibalism, it needs to rely on a crit. As you can see, heal all allies by 10% of his max HP when he inflicts a critical hit. So how you end up building Vrask is you build him with a ton of HP, you make him very, very beefy, and then you get him to 100% crit rate. Now what that's going to do is now, because he has so much HP and he's always critical hitting, every single time that he attacks, he's going to heal your entire team for a whole bunch of HP, because it's going to be based off of his maximum HP. Now, it's very important to have 100% crit rate for this skill, because if you don't and he doesn't critically hit, then this skill is not going to activate. Now, I know when I was switching a bunch of gear on my Vrask, I ran into this problem. I ended up switching out some gear and didn't even realize that I went below 100% critical rate. As you can see, 15 plus 85, I'm at 100% right now, so I'm fine. But this ended up dropping down to something like 94%. You know, even though that's only a 6% chance, when it comes to a champion and a skill that is so important like this, if he doesn't end up critically hitting, I missed that heal, and it actually can completely mess up an entire dungeon run. And I was realizing that I was actually failing a bunch of dungeons that I was normally easily passing before with no problem because of the simple gear change. Now, Vrask is just kind of an extreme example because of his critical rate, but this applies to a whole bunch of champions. You definitely want to keep in mind what gear you are switching and make sure that you don't lose any really important stats. Crit rate is a big one as well, because a lot of the times you'll build crit damage. Like Coldheart, crit damage is super massive because of her third skill. So if you end up losing a bunch of crit rate for Coldheart, and you have a bunch of crit damage on her, now you're just losing a whole bunch of the benefit from the crit damage, because obviously crit rate and crit damage are directly tied together. The more crit rate you have, the more you're going to benefit from crit damage. So definitely make sure that you do that. Plan out your gear changes a little bit. Not only are you going to save silver, but you're going to save a massive, massive headache like I had when I was switching gear around with my Vrask. All right, and tip number 5, this is another huge one. I see new players end up making this mistake all the time. I'm constantly seeing images, videos, discussions about this. I want to talk about it for a second because it is huge, especially for newer to mid-game players when it comes to prioritizing their gear, and that is make sure that you guys are upgrading your gloves, your chest, and your boots. Prioritize those and upgrade those maybe a little bit more so than your weapon, your helmet, and your shield. You are overall just going to get much more power from your champions when you prioritize this middle row of gear. The reason is because of the main stats. So once again, I know I've talked about this before in a lot of my more introductory gearing videos, but this is specifically why it's very important to prioritize these before you work on your weapon, helmet, and your shield. Is your middle row of gear, your gloves, your chest, and your boots is going to have much better main stats. You're going to have percentage-based main stats. I know gloves, for example, they have crit rate or crit damage. Boots are, of course, going to have speed. The stats and the main stats on your middle row of gear is going to be much better and overall provide a much bigger power benefit to your champion rather than this top row. So you've got flat attack on your weapon, flat HP on your helmet, flat defense on your shield. It's still good, but it's definitely not as good as the stats that you have on your middle row. So you want to maybe keep these a little, a couple levels higher. Like I'm doing for a lot of my champions or faction wars, I'll upgrade like these pieces of gear, or I'll try to upgrade them to like +8 and then keep these ones at +4, or maybe I'll upgrade these ones if I am going to use them more to +12, the middle row, and then the top row to +8. Overall, though, the basic idea is you want to invest a little bit more silver in your middle row because of those main stats. The main reason why you end up upgrading your top row isn't for the main stats, it's actually for the substats. And substats are overall a bit more of a late game priority, mid to late game, I would say. You want to work on good main stats before you really focus on putting your resources into those substats. So especially if you guys are newer, you absolutely want to prioritize putting your silver and your resources into your middle row and avoid spending too much money on your top row. So huge one that I see with newer players. And wow. Well, anyway, that was just 5 mistakes and 5 things that you guys want to avoid when gearing up. I threw a lot of info at you guys in this video, so I think I'm going to end up leaving it here. I'm really hoping that this video helped out, especially to those of you guys who might be newer, or I guess you could say in the mid game. Not all of these were for newer players, but I would say they probably apply towards the newer to mid-game players more so than the mid to late game players. But either way, if you guys did enjoy this video and you want more videos like this, consider subscribing to the channel. Really do appreciate everyone, all the support on the channel lately. It has been tremendous, so thank you, thank you. And of course, if you have a quick second and you want to help support, if you toss a quick like on the video, that means a whole lot, helps me out, so thank you to all of you guys who do that. With that all being said, that's going to be it for this video. Have a fantastic day, everyone, and until next time, this is Salt of the Salty Guild, signing out.